Hi AJ.
How are you?
I've got a group of spirit generated question, and it relates to the actual soul.
Yep.
They've been listening to your messages, God's messages through you, as I've been watching and listening to the MP3s.
Yep.
And the only time they've really started to believe something is when I started to process some of my own emotions.
Yes.
And that's probably been more so in the last, several weeks.
Can I explain why they've only started to believe since then?
Yep.
Because they as spirits can see the emotion leaving you.
Yeah.
And so they actually see it as colours exiting your spirit body. And so they can actually see that your emotional processing has an effect on you. And they also see the brightness of your body increase when these emotions leave you. And when you long for divine love, the brightness of your body increases, and they can actually see that happening.
And they've also felt the struggle I've had in disconnecting with them.
Yes.
And how I pushed through that.
Yep.
So it's several questions, but what they understand intellectually, if that's not the appropriate word, but they understand that they don't have a relationship with God. They actually thought that they were God themselves.
Right. Yep.
From the belief that they could create, and they've been existing for millions of years in the spirit world, and they could create whatever they wanted. But they
Can I ask them a specific question which you can answer? Have they actually been existing for millions of years?
Well, the truth of it is no.
No.
But they believe it.
They believe it. So the truth is that they have a memory of their beginning.
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
And they're attempting to bridge the gap themselves.
Yep.
So, and it's they're very entrenched in their beliefs, and they're doing a lot of teachings on the Earth plane at the moment.
Yep.
They call themselves Pleiadians, Sirians, Andromedas, sixth sphere, natural love, spirits. And
so do they know for certain they're in the sixth sphere?
they believe that they are.
Okay, and can we have a bright spirit just come to them and tell them where they are actually?
Well, they just wanted to explain to you that from their understanding, they see everyone as a physical body with what they call a PEMSA, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, astral body representation
they see
around the
the
world.
Emanations of the body.
Correct.
Yep.
And they also see that they believe they have a soul, and they call it a soul matrix, but more as an expression of a prism within the air pocket within our hearts, or their spirit body. So what they want to know from you is, how do you see yourself as being a soul in terms of form, substance? Because they don't identify themselves as being a soul. Mm-hmm. They also see that most people, and they work with a number of individuals in this audience actually, but they also understand that most of the people in this audience don't actually know what a soul is. They just accept the term, and they don't really understand what it is, and that's how they hook in as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated question, but they want you to...
From their perspective,
how can you change their belief so they start to identify themselves as being a soul and not just attributes within a soul?
The first thing I would suggest to them is that rather than having the viewpoint that I want to change their mind or change their beliefs, if we can have the viewpoint that we want to experiment with their beliefs. And they're used to that process of experimenting with beliefs through their own progression to where they are currently. Can we firstly ask, I know they don't really want to know the answer to this question, but if we can ask a bright spirit to come to them and answer the question of where they are actually in the spirit world at the moment.
Well, this particular... Well, there's one individual, he's in the fourth at the moment.
Okay. So they believe themselves to be here, but they're actually...
And he's saying that's only occurred because of the connection that he had with me that's challenged his... So he's had to step down.
Correct. They were in the sixth sphere, and they were experiencing a wide variety of what they would call truths in that state of the sixth sphere, which they could create themselves. So they feel themselves and can see themselves as powerful creators.
Extremely.
Yep. Now, when a person first starts connecting with their emotions, they have to go back and learn the things they didn't learn when they first traversed the dimensional existences. And when we're on the natural love path, which they have been on, as they traverse these spaces, they have a tendency to neglect their development in the third sphere and in the fifth sphere. The reason why is because those dimensional spaces are very highly emotional spaces. And so what these intellectual spirits have a tendency to do is to skip over these emotional spaces. Does that make sense? They don't feel very connected with emotion. They feel that they can intellect their way through most things. And so they have then the tendency to enter the third sphere, spend as little time in there as possible, and then they get in the fourth sphere that they enjoy a lot more, because there's a lot more intellectual knowledge in the fourth sphere than there is in the third. And then they spend a lot of their time in the fourth, and then they go into the fifth, and again it's very emotional. They don't like that very much. Many of them then go back to the fourth, and then they progress up to the sixth by just dealing with the moral aspects of development in these different dimensions. So what they've had to do is grow morally all the way through. Do they understand what I mean by that term?
He understands that, and he understands how he suppressed his emotions, because everything is about suppressing the feeling. It's controlling, acting in a certain manner.
Yep.
So
it's all about actions, not about how you feel about your actions.
Yep.
So you act in a loving manner rather than feeling loving.
Yeah. What he doesn't understand is how is it that he thinks he's real, but you're saying that the soul is actually the real you. So, and he looks at it as just a area within you.
I want to explain two things to him firstly. We'll come back to this because it's part of what I want to explain. But let's help him initially by looking at a basic truth. The basic truth that I'm presenting to him is this, that he is a half of a soul, so not even a full soul at this point. He has a body, a spirit body, and he had, when he was on Earth, a physical body. Can you remember the time period he was on Earth?
Yeah, Egyptian time period.
Egyptian time period, okay. So he was on Earth, around 5,000 or so years ago? Is that about right?
During the pyramid era.
Yeah, because that ranged from 14,000 years ago to 5,000 or 4,000 years ago or so. Anyway, so he was on Earth in this physical form at one point in time, but he still had, as he now knows, a spirit form that he didn't see at the time he was on Earth, but he now, because as soon as he entered into the spirit world, he realised he had it. So he has this spirit body form. But what happened in his development on Earth is he became very mind-based in his development, or intellectually based. Now that is the spirit body's mind. And as a result, the spirit body's mind affected the material body brain, and you learn a lot of things through that interface into the spirit's mind. So he has become mind dominant. In the process of mind dominance, what happens is the soul itself shrinks. So in other words, the soul becomes subservient to the mind of the spirit body. So the way God created us was, here's our soul, and the body was meant to be just an appendage of the soul. The soul is meant to use the body to do what it desires. But what he's done with his entire development is he's decided that that is the main portion of himself, what he would call his mind, or the universal mind that he attributes to himself, he's become godlike in his mind, but his mind has become the dominant thing, the dominant factor, and his emotions were seen to be just a subservient part of his mind. Does that make sense? Now, in the process of doing that, he has shut down development of his soul. So there's parts of his soul that, as a result of this mind dominance, get shut down, that we're not in tune with. And unfortunately, the progress that you make above the sixth sphere require these portions of your soul to open. So what we've got to do is know what the soul is to know how to open it. So your soul is the sum total of your desires, emotions, longings, passions, intentions, aspirations, and your mind, and your logic, and your consciousness, which is really just a consciousness of self. All of your memories are also stored in your soul, in this area of it. Now, the reason why he's having a lot of struggle connecting with this part of himself is because he's been living in his spirit body's mind for such a long time, right, quite a few thousand years, that it's very, very difficult for him to feel these things now. Now, my suggestion is, rather than trying to get an intellectual answer to his question, he would be best to go back to, and I know this is going to be quite confronting because there's a lot of resistance in spirits who have developed to the sixth sphere to actually connect with their life on Earth when they're on Earth, because they feel like they're beyond that now, right? But if he can allow himself to connect with his life on Earth, he can recognise that he had desires, that he had emotions, that he had longings and passions and intentions and aspirations at the time that he's actually tuned out of quite a lot during his progression in the spirit world, thinking that he had to do that to progress. The reality is that he doesn't have to do that to progress. What he can do is actually connect to those things and can progress in a much more rapid way than he has progressed. Now, in going back to the fourth sphere, or he actually went back to the third sphere is what he's actually done, and then he's progressed since then to the fourth. In going back to the third sphere, he started learning how to connect with his soul. That's the bit he missed out when he was in the third sphere originally, right? But he still has a strong desire to do the intellectual thing. He's still trying to drop the intellectual thing. And the intellectual dominance is what's causing most of his problems. In other words, he's thinking too much about the process rather than just doing the process and trusting that everything's going to be fine when he does it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that's what he's doing. Does he get that?
No, he definitely gets it.
Yeah. So if he allows the emotional process of reconnecting with his desires, emotions, longings, passions, and intention, he will be quite shocked at some of the emotions that are still there within him, but he will be able to release them very quickly by experiencing them. And he will progress then very quickly, and he'll be able to progress above the sixth dimension where he existed before and into the seventh as a result, and then into the eighth, into a one with God. But he'll only be able to do that if he allows the soul to become dominant, which means he's going to, and this is he knows that I've been through exactly this process that I'm describing to him now, so he knows that I had to drop this intellectual dominance that I had as well and just trust this soul process. So he can see from what experiences I've had within me of what I went through emotionally to have to drop this intellectual dominance. And it's quite hard to do, because you've got to stop the mind from working overtime all the time trying to work out what's happening, and just allow the soul to feel and experience its feelings and experiences. When you allow that, then you're starting to really connect with your soul, the real self. You allow yourself to be real in every moment. When you allow yourself to be real in every moment, what happens is you start enjoying the odd spheres of the spirit world for a start. So if he goes back to the third sphere, he'll find when he's in the soul-based space, he will enjoy the third sphere. When he's not in the soul-based space, he will enjoy the fourth sphere rather than the third sphere, because the fourth sphere is more about intellectual things. You've got to learn about morals and so forth. And then when he gets to the fifth sphere, he will enjoy the fifth sphere a lot more, because there's a lot of beautiful unfoldings that occur in the fifth sphere as well to the soul, and he'll actually enjoy that process. And he'll get back up to the sixth sphere, and where he was comfortable before, he will feel like, wow, this is really limiting. This feels really different. And because he's now feeling his emotions quite a lot, he'll find he'll probably go back to the fifth sphere, spend more time there, and then when he can get into the seventh sphere, make that transition. And when he's there, he will start feeling a lot of differences in himself. Huge differences, in fact. He will no longer be intellectually dominant. He will be primarily soul dominant, primarily emotion, feeling, desire-based dominance. But ironically, the dominance, the desires and the emotions and the feelings are all harmonious with love in that space. Whereas here, he was intellectually dominant and he was forcing himself to be in that space. Here, he's now in that space, but it's easy. It's really easy to stay in that space. And then when he becomes at one with God, which is the transition into the eighth dimension, he will actually find it's impossible for him to actually do things that were damaging or think things that are damaging anymore. And he'll be in a purely emotional space rather than an intellectual space. So that's what he can do in terms of his progression. The barrier to that is the mind wanting to regain control. And for me, what it felt like when I made this transition, and he can see this happened, is it felt like to a degree I was losing my mind. And it's a very fearful place because you don't know what's beyond losing your mind. Does that make sense? Now he can see that hardly anything that I speak of touches my mind. It just sort of flows out of me. And the reason why is I don't have to think about it anymore. It just comes from this location. It comes from my soul, and my voice and my brain and everything are just a response to the soul's longings, to the soul describing something. So he can see that process occurring in me, so he knows that that can be a place where he can be too. So while he tries to retain his intellectual dominance, he's going to be very afraid of losing his mind. But once you get beyond the fear of losing your mind, you actually go through the fear of losing your mind, you'll come out the other end realising that your mind wasn't very powerful in the first place, and this other part of you, which you've been denying for such a long time, is actually the most powerful place you can be. Yeah. And he can ask as many questions as he wants in this process. I'm perfectly happy to answer them.
He's actually communicating to a few people here, including that lady in relation to her personal truth.
Yeah.
And he says he understands his own truth.
That's right.
And you are also going through your own process.
Sorry,
He's going through his own process.
Yes, he's struggling
connect
with the concept of absolute truth compared to his personal truth as well, isn't he?
And he's able to connect through me and a lot of other people here because of, I guess, we're highly intellectual beings and stuck in our minds.
Yeah, and the truth is that when we are intellectually dominant ourselves, we will attract intellectually dominant spirits who feel very attracted to us because they are teaching us to do. And what we need to do is get into this place. And because you've done that in the last few weeks in particular, he has seen the shift in your soul.
And he saw John Lennon go through his process.
Right, yeah. So he was present when I channeled with John Lennon. Yep, okay. So he could see him go through the same process, so that's wonderful. And then it's just a matter of him saying, well, okay, I can see here that the intellectual dominance is the thing that's harming me, actually. My desire for the intellect to understand doesn't help me grow. The child, when you look at a child learns through experience, through experiential events. The child has very little intellectual dominance. For example, can you imagine a child, it's on the ground and it's getting up to walk. It's going, oh, what do I do now? What do I do now? Right? Can you imagine the child doing that? The child doesn't do that, does it? It just naturally feels its way, like up, and it's wobbling, and like a drunk old man in a lot of ways, right? That's how the child is. But it's experiencing the process, right? And so it falls down and then it gets up again, and it's experiencing the process. And it didn't have to do any of that intellectually. And what I'm saying to him is actually, when he reconnects with that part of the soul, he will realise actually that part of the soul is more powerful than anything his mind can ever produce. And that part of the soul has been with him since his incarnation, his first conception, when he was first on the earth. And as he's grown through this process, what's happened is that part of the soul has been suppressed quite strongly. But it's still there. It's still within him. He's able to do this just like all of us can. And as he grows this part of the soul, he will find the same joy the child had, which is the joy of experiencing everything in a manner that you go through the experience. And you come out the other end with all this intellectual knowledge, but it doesn't matter very much because the experience was the thing you enjoyed. Whereas at the moment, he's having to learn all this intellectual knowledge, right? But he's not so much enjoying the experience because of the soul part of it being shut down. And this is the problem when we become intellectually dominant on the earth. We actually lose this childlike way of learning. So by the time we're 5 years of age and we're going along to school, that childlike way of learning has generally been shut down in us quite strongly because we've had all sorts of punishment, all sorts of corrections via our environment that we've shut down this part of our learning process. It's interesting, if you don't shut down that part of our learning process, the child can grow so rapidly that by the time they're 10, they can learn anything that any person in university has ever learned. right, if they don't shut down this part of the process.
Well, he thanks you, and he's exploring his own truths at the moment. So
of course.
That's what he's
So
doing.
explore away. Obviously, you'll listen to me say these things, and go away and listen to an Indian guru say his things, and listen to a Buddhist guru say his things, and listen to normal A.J. Miller say these things, and after a while experiment with all of these different things, hopefully. But in the experimentation, understand that if you try to experiment with your mind only, you will not find this divine love path that I'm teaching. You have to, and this is why there's only one way, because you have to reconnect with your soul. You have to progress beyond. So while he's allowed to experiment for the rest of his existence, my suggestion is don't spend too much of his time experimenting and philosophizing. Spend more of his time experimenting by putting the emotional part of the soul into action, just like he notices you doing. Just do the same as that, and when he does that, he'll find very rapid progress is available to him.
Well, he felt triggered by the two questions that the gentleman had asked about rape, and
yes.
He was curious what the causal emotion is for this group, for hearing that question, the law of attraction, for
yep.
hearing that question,
well,
and it somehow relates to him as well.
He can see that quite a number of women in the audience have been abused as children. Can he see that?
He can see it, but he doesn't choose to.
So just allow the emotion. What does he really see? Does he see some of the men have also been abused in the audience too?
He sees a lot of injuries relating to his female and male anger.
Yes, good. Now, can he also see that in his own childhood he was abused?
He can, but I'm disconnecting.
Okay, so if you can just allow your feelings to just pass through, the truth is actually that in his own childhood when he was on earth, he was personally sexually abused.
He'll be back.
He's off to process that one. So the law of attraction for asking some of these questions are actually revolving around the fact that many of us do shut down our childhood events. And for him, obviously, he's also shut down the childhood abuse that has occurred in his childhood. And that occurs, and then we have this beautiful law of attraction where somebody in the audience asked the question. Now, why did I ask the question? Because there's inspiration oftentimes of, wow, I can feel quite a few people are in this condition, denying this particular emotion. And then that question gets asked so that the answer can come and people can look at their law of attraction about why the question is asked.
You can actually feel him running around and connecting to different people.
Yep.
So he's not isolating to one individual.
Yeah. And he's actually, at the moment, connecting to the people who are, what do you notice?
Well, willing to ask a question.
Who are willing to ask questions and who are intellectually
very
dominant.
intellectual dominant.
Yep. So he's getting many of you, to ask questions, intellectual-based questions, because of the intellectual dominance that he has. And you'll find groups of spirits do this very frequently in any course of any kind, but particularly in courses related to their own spiritual development.
Can I ask a